At the conclusion of the Spanish-American War, Cuba had gained its independence from Spain. However, this freedom came at a cost. The United States has organized the terms of the Treaty of Paris without inviting a Cuban representative to the signing of the treaty. The United States restricted Cuban independence for their own interest. The U.S. forced Cuba to agree to letting the U.S. involve itself in any Cuban affairs and set up military bases on the island, such as the one in Guantanamo Bay. These restrictions created anti-U.S. sentiments amongst the people of the island. Many of the leaders who led Cuba following the Spanish-American War were U.S.-backed. They were unpopular amongst the people, and leaders such as Fulgencio Batista created military regimes that inspired many independence movements, most notably that of Fidel Castro and his socialist supporters. Fidel Castro was one of the most influential and controversial figures in Cuban history. Unlike most Cubans, he was born to an upper-middle-class family out of wedlock. With his family's wealth, he could afford to attend several Jesuit schools throughout Cuba, where he explored concepts of politics, economics, and morality. As a child, Fidel was known as a troublemaker, being expelled from numerous schools. As a young adult, Castro was involved in several revolutions and overthrows. What shot him to power was his conflicts with Fulgencio Batista. Batista was elected president, but towards the end of his first term, he realized he was not going to win a re-election. Because of this, he organized a military coup to remain in power. The coup was backed by the United States as socialist sentiments began to grow in Cuba, and they wanted to control the spread of communism. Batista created a ruthless dictatorship that abused the Cuban people. To combat the abusive dictatorship, Castro organized an attack on the Moncada barracks, a military stronghold. The attack would later be known as the July 26 movement. The siege ended poorly for Castro's revolutionaries, who were severely outnumbered and outgunned. Batista imprisoned Castro and his supporters. However, after only 2 years in prison, Batista no longer saw Castro and his revolutionaries as a threat and decided to release them. While he was in prison, Castro became the figurehead of a socialist movement sweep in Cuba. Once he was released, there was a sudden increase in military aggression on suspected revolutionaries in Cuba, so Fidel and his brother Raúl fled to Mexico to avoid capture. In Mexico, they would meet an Argentinian revolutionary by the name of Che Guevara, who played an instrumental role in planning the revolution. They spent 2 years in Mexico planning their return. Meanwhile, in Cuba, the revolutionary movements are growing larger and the government is becoming increasingly wary of Castro's return. 2 years later, Castro and his revolutionaries sailed back to Cuba and ended up in the Sierra Maestra mountain range. Over time, Castro would seize more villages and gain supporters. Eventually, he became so popular that he marched right into Havana with his troops and took the city with ease. Castro seized power in February of 1959 with overwhelming support. He sought to improve living conditions for the impoverished Cubans through his implementation of socialist policies. He improved schools, brought electricity to rural towns, and gave American land back to the Cuban people. Castro's sudden rise to power worried the United States, who at the time was trying to limit the spread of communism. The U.S. placed sanctions on Cuba, which damaged the economy of the developing nation. In 1961, the U.S. planned a surprise invasion on the south shore of Cuba, known as the Bay of Pigs invasion. The U.S. was defeated in only 24 hours. After the attack, Cuba sought an alliance between them and the Soviet Union. This would later lead to the Cuban Missile Crisis, in which the USSR stored missiles in Cuba, while the U.S. stored missiles in Italy and Turkey. For about 2 weeks, both the U.S. and Soviet Union had nuclear weapons pointing right at each other, and each party, at times, was very close to firing them. Eventually, the situation was resolved diplomatically, and both countries removed their weapons. It is hard to deny the impact Castro had on Cuba's history, despite his controversial reputation. While he did improve education and got rid of American businesses in Cuba, he left his country impoverished and refused to give up his power. Despite this, Castro's impact can still be seen today, as it has heavily influenced where Cuba is today as a world power.